The Kael'thar Empire had ruled the stars for so long that its history was carved into the bones of conquered worlds. To many, their rise was not a story of conquest but of inevitability. Like the flood or the storm, the Empire swept across the galaxy with a force that could not be reasoned with, could not be bargained with, and could not be stopped. They were ancient when humanity was still learning to light fires in caves. They had perfected war long before Earth had drawn its first maps. Their fleets were forged in black forges orbiting dying suns, ships so vast that entire cities could rest inside their hulls. When their banners appeared in the sky, civilizations did not argue. They surrendered. To resist was to be erased. For centuries, no one dared to dream of resistance. Entire species carried the scars of their defiance. The ruins of their homeworlds scattered across dead systems, memorials of arrogance in the face of overwhelming power. The Kael'thar called themselves eternal, and the galaxy, beaten and silent, believed them. But even empires that feel eternal live in fear of stagnation. The Kael'thar sought new victories, not because they needed more, but because their pride demanded it. And so their gaze turned to the Sol system, to a blue planet turning quietly around its star, home to a species that had never known them, never bent knee, never whispered their name with fear. To the Kael'thar, humanity was insignificant. They were young, barely stepping into the void with fragile ships of steel and fire. Their colonies were few, scattered on neighboring planets and moons. They had no grand alliances, no ancient empires guarding their flanks. To the Empire, humanity looked like prey, and prey was meant to kneel. The declaration of war came as it always did, with arrogance dressed as ceremony. Across every human channel, from the smallest outpost near Saturn to the crowded streets of Earth's cities, the same broadcast appeared, a towering Kael'thar envoy, framed in golden shadow, speaking with the authority of millennia. Surrender, inhabitants of Earth. Lay down your arms, kneel before the rightful lords of the stars, and you shall be permitted to live beneath our reign. Resist and be unmade. We are the Kael'thar, the strongest empire. Your choices are compliance or extinction. The words carried no anger, only certainty. To them, this was not war. It was an announcement, as if telling the seasons to change. And yet, among the billions watching, a strange silence followed. Not because of fear alone, but because the message struck something deeper, something old. Humanity had been told before by tyrants, by kings, by empires, that it must kneel. And always somewhere, someone had said no. The Kael'thar did not know the history of Earth. They did not know of the burning cities rebuilt from ash, of families who endured famine and fire and still found a way to sing. They did not know of soldiers who fought with nothing but courage when weapons failed, or of dreamers who stared into the impossible sky and refused to believe it unreachable. The Kael'thar thought they had found a species that would cower. Instead, they had found a species forged in struggle. On that day, across Earth and her colonies, the declaration did not create despair. It created unity. For centuries, humanity had known division, had quarreled over land, belief, and power. But as the words of the Empire echoed in the air, a realization spread like fire through dry grass. This was not a war of one nation, not a conflict of politics or borders. It was survival itself. And survival was something humanity understood better than any empire ever could. In the skies above Earth, the Kael'thar ships turned in their silent majesty, awaiting submission. They expected to see surrender and frightened faces. Instead, they were met with silence, heavy, gathering, unbroken silence. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The Empire had cast its shadow upon humanity, confident that all would bow. But in that shadow a spark flickered, a spark the Kael'thar could not see, but one that would burn across the stars. The strongest empire had declared war, and humanity, though wounded and unprepared, would answer. Captain Elias Ward sat alone in the command chair of the battleship Sol's Dawn, his gaze fixed on the silent image that lingered across the main screen. The Kael'thar envoy's words still echoed in his ears, though the transmission had ended minutes ago. The alien's voice had been calm, almost gentle, as it promised humanity's destruction. It had not needed to thunder to make itself terrifying. Certainty was enough. The crew around Elias sat frozen. They were not cowards, they had faced danger before, but this was something different. To them it was as if the very universe itself had just leaned down and told them they were unworthy of existence. Elias's hands tightened around the arms of his chair. His father had been a teacher back on Earth, a man who loved history. He had told Elias once, when he was still a boy, "Every empire believes itself invincible, but history remembers the ones who were wrong." The thought made Elias's chest burn. He turned to his crew. Their faces were pale, some trembling, some staring into nothing, but he saw it. The flicker. The spark. They were afraid, yes, but beneath the fear was something older, something no empire could ever erase. He rose from his chair. "You all heard them," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the bridge. "They think we will kneel. They think fear will break us. But we are human. We don't kneel. We don't break. Not to tyrants. Not to empires. Not to anyone." For a moment silence held. Then one by one, heads lifted. A young officer at the communications station drew a shaky breath. A weapons engineer clenched her fist. Their fear did not vanish, but it bent into something else. Resolve. And far beyond the bridge of the soul's dawn, that same spark was catching. On Earth, in crowded cities where families watched the alien declaration on public screens, strangers gripped each other's hands. In quiet kitchens, parents whispered to their children that they would not surrender. In laboratories, scientists abandoned rivalries and called old enemies to share knowledge. In governments across the planet, leaders who had once spoken only in accusation now spoke of unity. For the first time in centuries, the divisions that had scarred humanity seemed suddenly small. The world that had once argued endlessly over borders now looked up at the stars and saw only one truth. They stood together, or they would fall alone. On Mars, miners left their shafts and signed their names to fight. On Luna, engineers began welding new frames for ships, their sparks scattering like stars against the black. In the asteroid colonies, voices rose in determination. "If Earth falls, we all fall. We will not let that happen." The Kalthar had thought to frighten humanity into silence. Instead, they had given humanity its first true purpose. Among the many voices rising that day, one belonged to Mira Hale, a navigation officer on Sol's Dawn. She had been silent through the envoy's words, her mind drifting back to her brother Daniel, stationed on a smaller patrol ship near Neptune. She knew he must have heard the same message. She knew what he would be thinking. He had always told her, "If anyone tries to tell me my life has no worth, I'll make sure they regret it." Mira's lips trembled, but then she straightened, her eyes blazing. "Captain," she said softly but with iron in her voice, "they don't know who we are." Elias met her gaze and nodded. "They will." Across the solar system, the machinery of preparation roared to life. Ships long considered obsolete were dragged from mothball yards and refitted. Old defense platforms, quiet for decades, powered up. Volunteers poured into recruitment stations, not just soldiers, but farmers, doctors, engineers, everyone willing to lend hands to the cause. It was not perfect. Humanity was not a polished empire with centuries of planning behind its fleets. They were disorganized, scattered, often improvising. But where the Kalthar had cold machines of war, humanity had something else. A fire that no empire could measure. In the heart of the solar system, the spark lit by the empire's arrogance became a flame. And as the Kalthar ships advanced slowly, patiently toward Earth, confident in their superiority, they could not see that flame growing brighter with every passing hour. The galaxy had always believed humanity to be young, fragile, still crawling out of its cradle. But the Kalthar had made a mistake. They had confused youth with weakness. In truth, youth meant hunger. Youth meant dreams. Youth meant defiance. And so, as the alien fleet darkened the edge of the sky, humanity answered, not with submission, not with surrender, but with a single unifying thought: we will not go quietly. The spark had been struck. Soon the fire would burn. The Kalthar fleet arrived with the silence of inevitability. More than 100 warships, each vast enough to blot out the stars behind them, entered the solar system in perfect formation. Their hulls shimmered with black alloys, their weapons bristled like forests of steel. To those who watched from observatories and orbital stations, it felt as though night itself had risen to swallow the planets. The Empire expected swift victory. To them, the conquest of Earth was not a battle but a ceremony, the way a lion claims its prey. Their commanders predicted the entire campaign would be over in weeks, perhaps even days. They expected humanity to scatter, to beg, to crumble. But they did not yet understand. From Earth's orbit, the first human defense platforms activated. Satellites that had once been dismissed as old or obsolete suddenly blazed to life. Their cores refitted with weapons crafted in desperation. Hundreds of orbital cannons turned as one, aligning on the intruders. From hidden shipyards buried deep in the asteroid belt rose fleets of human warships, smaller, rougher, less advanced than the Kalthar vessels, but armed with a strength the enemy could not calculate: human will. The Soul's Dawn led the charge, her engines burning bright as she ascended to meet the storm. Captain Elias Ward stood at the command deck, his hands steady as alarms pulsed around him. "All ships," he ordered, "form up. Today we show them Earth is no prey." The comms filled with voices, some firm, some trembling, but all resolute. Ships with names like Resolve, Liberty, Endurance took their places beside Soul's Dawn. They were not perfect fleets. Many bore scars from rushed assembly, untested weapons, crews of volunteers who had never seen battle, but their spirits were unbroken. The Kalthar commander, watching from his flagship, sneered. "They come to meet us? Brave, yet foolish." His voice was calm, dismissive. He had seen countless species resist before, only to crumble. This would be no different, he told himself. The first shot shattered the silence. It came not from the Kalthar, but from humanity. A single missile launched from an Earthside silo streaked upward into the void. It struck one of the Empire's destroyers. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to scar its black hull and ignite fire along its surface. The damage was minor. The message was not. Humanity had fired first. In response, the Empire unleashed its fury. Beams of light seared across the void, striking Earth's defenses. Entire satellites disintegrated in brilliant flashes. Orbital platforms shattered into debris fields. Human ships were caught in the storm. Some vanished in silence, others erupted in fire that streaked across the sky. On Earth below, cities trembled. The night lit up as pieces of burning wreckage fell through the atmosphere. In crowded shelters, children pressed against their parents, eyes wide as the heavens burned. But for every loss, humanity struck back. Soul's Dawn and her fleet weaved through enemy lines, hurling missiles and kinetic slugs with relentless precision. A Kalthar cruiser fell, then another, its core rupturing in a silent explosion that painted the darkness with light. Mira Hale stood at her station, her voice sharp as she called out coordinates. "Enemy at starboard. Adjust trajectory 3 degrees. Sweat streaked her brow, but her hands did not falter. Each command, each adjustment was her defiance. Somewhere beyond the chaos, she imagined her brother's ship fighting as well, and the thought gave her strength. The battle raged for hours, neither side willing to yield. Humanity bled heavily. Dozens of ships were lost, countless lives extinguished. But the impossible had happened. The Kalthar, the empire that had never known resistance, had been struck. Their ships burned. Their dead floated in the void. When at last the fleets pulled apart, neither side victorious, the galaxy itself seemed to shudder. Word spread quickly across conquered worlds and silent stations. The Kalthar had faced defiance, and for the first time in centuries, they had not won swiftly. On Soul's Dawn, silence hung heavy over the bridge. The crew stared at the wreckage drifting outside their windows, the remains of comrades, the scars of battle. Grief pressed on them like gravity, yet beneath it there was also something else. Hope. Elias Ward looked out at the ruined horizon, his jaw tight. "They expected us to break," he said softly, almost to himself. "Instead, we showed them we can bleed them." Mira nodded, her eyes fierce through exhaustion. "We made them see us. The first blow had been struck. Humanity was wounded, battered, and grieving, but they were still standing. And in that truth, the strongest empire had discovered something it had never faced before. Humanity would not fall quietly. The aftermath of the first great clash lingered like smoke after fire. The Kalthar had withdrawn, but the sky above Earth still glittered with the wreckage of ships, some alien, some human. Debris rained into atmospheres across the solar system, streaking as falling stars, each one a grave without a name. On Earth, crowds gathered on rooftops and hillsides, watching the sky burn. They whispered prayers for the lost. They held each other tightly, not knowing if tomorrow would bring salvation or ruin. Yet even in grief there was pride. Humanity had not been erased. They had stood against giants, and though they bled, they were still here. Aboard the Soul's Dawn, the air was heavy with silence. The crew moved slowly, not from fatigue alone, but from mourning. Names of the fallen were read in hushed voices. Screens flickered with reports of destroyed vessels, each one carrying friends, brothers, sisters. Mira Hale sat at her station, her face pale. She had not heard from her brother Daniel's ship since the battle began. She had sent calls into the void, desperate signals searching for an answer, but only static had returned. Deep down she knew, yet she clung to the possibility that perhaps his ship had escaped, hidden, waiting. She pressed her hand against the console, whispering to herself, "You promised me you'd come back." Captain Elias Ward watched her from the command chair, his own heart heavy. He had lost comrades too, men and women who had served beside him for years. But as captain, he bore another weight, the knowledge that every loss was tied to his decisions. He knew he could not allow grief to break him, but he also knew he could never forget it. That night, in the quiet of the captain's quarters, Elias wrote the first of many letters to families on Earth. Each one was simple, handwritten, not by machine. Your son fought bravely. Your daughter stood with courage. They did not fall in vain. He did not know if such words could ease pain, but he knew they were necessary. The war became a rhythm of fire and loss. Every battle humanity fought was bought with sacrifice. Ships were destroyed faster than they could be built. Volunteers lined up, but each wave returned with fewer than before. Families on Earth learned to live with empty chairs at dinner tables. Photographs hung on walls like eternal vigil. And yet, the resilience of humanity shone brightest in those darkest hours. On Luna, engineers who had lost loved ones poured their grief into steel, welding frames for new ships with hands that trembled but did not stop. On Mars, miners dug deeper, harvesting metals to fuel the war, saying to one another, "For every brother and sister lost, we will give them 10 more ships." On Earth itself, farmers plowed under skies filled with falling debris, growing food not just for their families, but for soldiers who might never return. The Kael'thar could not comprehend it. To them, loyalty was forged by fear, and when fear failed, obedience shattered. But humans turned loss into fuel. Every funeral became a vow. Every scar became a reason to rise again. Mira returned to duty the morning after she wept for her brother. Her hands shook as she adjusted navigational charts, her voice cracked when she spoke commands, but her eyes carried fire. When Elias asked her why she came back so soon, she answered in a whisper, "For him. If I stop, then he is truly gone. But if I keep fighting, then he fights with me." Those words spread across the ship, carried from mouth to mouth. Soon they became something larger than grief. They became a creed. Every crew member repeated them quietly at first, then louder. "For them, we keep fighting." The Kael'thar pressed harder. They sent more ships, larger fleets, believing humanity must eventually break. But the harder they pressed, the deeper humanity's roots dug into the soil of survival. It was not an easy defiance. Cities burned. Colonies fell silent. Families were torn apart. The price was immense, and there were moments when despair hovered close. Yet always, in the heart of loss, humanity found one another. The Kael'thar saw something they had never seen before. A people who met death not with surrender, but with love. Love so fierce it turned to... Months passed, and the war carved deep scars across the solar system. Humanity had endured its first trials, had buried its dead, and had learned to grieve without surrender. Where the Kael'thar had expected collapse, they found persistence. And more than persistence, they found adaptation. Humans were not the oldest species, nor the strongest, nor the most advanced. But they were quick. They learned. Where the Kael'thar saw primitives wielding crude weapons, within weeks those primitives were reshaping alien technology into their own, captured. Debris from enemy vessels was hauled into makeshift labs on Mars and Luna. Engineers with little sleep and trembling hands tore apart strange alloys, deciphered unfamiliar circuits, and rebuilt them into human weapons. Laser batteries once foreign now hummed aboard Earthships. Shields once thought impossible shimmered in defense of fragile colonies. Humanity had taken the Kael'thar's arrogance and turned it into tools of survival. It was not only technology. Humanity adapted in spirit. Pilots who had never fought beyond Earth's orbit became predators in the dark. They studied Kael'thar maneuvers, anticipated their rhythms, and struck with precision. Commanders began weaving strategies that the Empire's war councils had never considered, tricks born of desperation and creativity, not tradition. On the Sol's dawn, Captain Elias Ward saw the change. The first battles had been filled with fear and hesitation. Now his crew moved with certainty, each one driven not only by orders but by belief. Mirahale, once trembling at her console, now plotted maneuvers so daring they turned the tide of engagements. "They think in lines," she told Elias one evening, pointing to enemy trajectories. "We think in storms." The Kael'thar did not understand storms. The turning point came at Titan. The Empire had established a command ship in orbit of Saturn's moon, a vessel so massive it dwarfed any human creation. Its presence was meant to remind Earth of futility, but Elias saw opportunity. The plan was reckless, almost unthinkable. A fleet of smaller human ships would feign retreat, drawing the Kael'thar into pursuit. Meanwhile, Sol's-Dawn and her allies would circle through Saturn's rings, using the swirling ice as cover. It was dangerous. Navigation in the rings could tear ships apart, but it was the kind of danger humanity embraced. The battle erupted in a blaze of fire. Human ships darted like sparks, their smaller frames weaving between the Kael'thar giants. Explosions lit the void, ice shattered in showers of brilliance. At the climax, Sol's Dawn emerged from the shadow of Saturn itself, hurling every weapon at the command ship. The first barrage weakened its shields. The second pierced its hull. The third struck its core, and the great Kael'thar command ship, symbol of their dominance, shattered in a silent explosion that turned Titan's skies into a storm of fire. For a long moment, even the Kael'thar seemed frozen. Their empire had lost ships before, yes, but never like this. Never to a species they had called young, insignificant, fragile. Humanity had not only survived, they had struck at the heart of the Empire's pride. Across the solar system, cheers erupted. On Mars, miners abandoned their drills to embrace one another. On Earth, crowds gathered in streets, weeping as they watched the fiery wreckage fall. Children who had once asked their parents, "Will we survive?" now whispered, "We can win." The Kael'thar Council convened in fury. Their commanders spoke of miscalculation, of mistakes that would be corrected. But beneath their arrogance, fear stirred. The unthinkable had happened. Their might was not absolute. And beyond the solar system, whispers spread. On conquered worlds, enslaved peoples lifted their eyes to the stars. They heard of humans who had defied the eternal empire, who had bled and burned but had not broken. They heard of Titan, of the command ship's fall. For the first time in generations, hope stirred in places where only silence had lived. On Sol's Dawn, Elias stood at the viewport, watching Titan's rings shimmer with the debris of victory. His crew cheered, but he remained solemn. He knew what victory meant. It meant the Kael'thar would return, angrier, stronger. Yet still, his voice carried pride when he spoke to his officers. "They believed us children. They believed we would run. Today we showed them what humanity is." Today the storm began. Mira, standing beside him, nodded. Her eyes, once shadowed by grief, now burned with fierce light. "We're not done. We're only beginning." And across the stars, in the halls of the mighty empire, those words echoed like thunder. The Kael'thar Empire had been humiliated. The destruction of their command ship over Titan had rippled across their dominion like cracks in glass. Whole sectors whispered that the Empire was not eternal. Worlds that had once cowered began to ask questions. Rebellion flickered like distant sparks. The Emperor of Kael'thar could not allow it. His empire had ruled for millennia by fear, and fear had to be restored. So he summoned the greatest fleet in the history of his people, an armada of 1,000,000 warships drawn from every corner of the stars. Cruisers, dreadnoughts, carriers, entire fortress ships the size of moons, all bound together into a tide of iron and fire. When they emerged at the edge of the solar system, it was as if the night itself had grown teeth. Their shadows swallowed planets. Their signal broadcasts blotted out human communications. Across Earth and her colonies, billions looked upward and saw the sky filled with death. For many, fear struck deep. How could one small species face this? How could fragile ships of steel and determination withstand a storm that had drowned galaxies? Parents held children tightly. Soldiers gripped their weapons with trembling hands. Even Elias Ward, aboard Sol's Dawn, felt the weight of despair pressing in. For a heartbeat, he wondered if this was the end. But then he looked at his crew, faces tired, eyes shadowed with grief, yet each one standing firm. He looked at Mira Hale, her brother's loss still carved into her heart, yet her hands steady at her station. And he remembered the truth. Humanity had never been promised survival. It had always been earned again and again, through storms, famine, fire, and war. This was no different. "Transmit to all frequencies," Elias ordered, his voice steady, hearing the weight of every life depending on him. The comm officer nodded, fingers flying. "Channel open, Captain." Elias stood tall, every word sharp as steel. "This is Captain Elias Ward of the United Human Fleet. To the Kyle-Thar Empire and to every world listening. You declared war upon us, believing we would bow. You thought us weak. You thought us prey. But hear me now, humanity does not kneel. Humanity does not break. If you wish to see the measure of our spirit, come and face it. We will meet you here in the skies above our home, and we will not yield." The words rippled outward, carried across stars, piercing even the Kelthar's arrogance. To the enemy it was defiance. To humanity, it was a promise. Mira whispered as the transmission ended, her eyes fierce. That was the answer they were waiting for. The fleets collided. It was a battle unlike any the galaxy had seen. Kelthar dreadnoughts unleashed torrents of fire that could boil oceans. Fortress ships hammered human defenses with weapons capable of shattering moons. Entire cities on Earth trembled as shockwaves rippled across space. But humanity fought like no enemy the Empire had ever known. Small ships darted through colossal formations, striking at weak points with precision. Carriers launched squadrons that moved like swarms of fireflies, overwhelming the giants through sheer coordination. Orbital defenses lit the sky, weaving a curtain of fire. Losses were staggering. Human ships vanished in flames. Colonies screamed as Kyle-Thar weapons found them. Yet with each loss, humanity struck harder. Engineers rerouted power from shattered systems to fire one last volley. Pilots rammed burning ships into enemy hulls, turning death into victory. Soldiers aboard captured vessels fought room by room, never giving ground. On the bridge of Sol's Dawn, chaos reigned, but Elias's voice was unshaken. "Hold the line! Make them bleed for every inch." Mira's eyes glistened as she read out trajectories. "Enemy flagship moving to intercept." "They're underestimating our speed. They think we'll turn. But we won't." "Then we won't," Elias said, and Sol's Dawn plunged forward, straight into the jaws of the Empire's might. The battle roared for hours, then days, each side pouring everything into the storm. The Kelthar fought with pride, but humanity fought with desperation and with love. Love for families waiting below, love for brothers and sisters already lost, love for a home they refused to surrender. And in the void, that love burned brighter than any weapon. The Kelthar had demanded submission. Humanity's answer was written in fire across the stars. The battle raged until the stars themselves seemed dim beneath the fire. For days, the solar system burned with light and shadow as human fleets clashed against the vast armada of the Kelthar. Entire moons trembled under bombardment, planets rang with the echo of war, and space itself glittered with the wreckage of titans. But then, silence. The Kelthar armada, once 1,000,000 strong, was broken. Scattered survivors fled into the void, their discipline shattered, their pride bleeding into the dark. Their great fortress ships, once believed indestructible, lay adrift or in ruin. And in the center of the chaos, though battered and scarred, humanity still stood. The Sol's Dawn floated amid wreckage, her hull cracked, her engines flickering. Inside, the crew moved like ghosts, exhausted, bloodied, but alive. Elias Ward stood at the viewport, watching the drifting remains of the Empire's fleet. For a long moment he did not speak. He thought of the faces lost, the names he would never read again, the cities scarred, the families broken. Victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival. Mira Hale approached, her uniform torn, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "It's over," she whispered. Elias shook his head slowly. No, not over, changed forever. Because what had ended was not merely a battle. It was the illusion of the Kelthar's eternity. The galaxy had witnessed their fall. Their enemies had seen that they could be wounded. Their subjects had seen that they could be defied. And more than that, they had seen humanity. In the weeks that followed, emissaries came from distant systems, timid at first, then bolder. Peoples long enslaved by the Kelthar sent messages of gratitude, of astonishment. Some offered alliances, others simply whispered a single word carried like prayer: hope. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy saw possibility beyond the Empire's shadow. Yet humanity did not rise as conquerors. They did not chain worlds or demand tribute. Instead, their fleets returned to dockyards. Their soldiers returned to farms, to cities, to families. Engineers turned weapons into tools for rebuilding. Humanity had fought not to rule, but to live. And that was their greatest strength. On Earth, children gathered in classrooms, their teachers telling stories of the war. They learned not only of the battles, but of the courage that had carried humanity through. They learned of sacrifice, not as tragedy alone, but as proof of love. They heard of the miners on Mars who had forged steel in the face of despair, of the engineers on Luna who had built ships faster than grief could consume them, of the soldiers who had whispered for them, "We keep fighting," before charging into fire. Mira Hale returned to her family home by the sea. Her brother's absence was an ache she carried every day, but when she looked up at the stars, she no longer felt only grief. She felt pride, that Daniel's sacrifice was part of something larger than either of them, something that would echo long after both their names were forgotten. She planted a tree in his memory, its roots reaching deep into Earth's soil, its branches stretching toward the endless sky. Elias Ward declined honors and medals. He visited the families of the fallen, sitting in quiet living rooms holding the hands of mothers, fathers, and children. He spoke to them not as a hero, but as a man who had shared their loss. When they asked him how humanity had endured, he said only, "Because we could not imagine a world without each other." And across the galaxy, that was what humanity came to symbolize: not endless strength, not flawless technology, but resilience born of love, unity carved from struggle. The empire that had once called itself eternal had been defeated not by greater weapons but by a spirit it could never understand. Generations later, songs were still sung of the war. Children of distant stars who had never seen Earth told the tale with awe, of the day the strongest empire declared war, and of the humans who answered mercilessly, not with cruelty, but with unyielding fire. They would not remember every ship nor every commander. They would not remember each battlefield by name. But they would remember the truth that when all seemed hopeless, humanity stood. Humanity endured. Humanity fought for one another, and in that defiance the galaxy found freedom. The Kelthar had wanted the galaxy to fear them forever. Instead, the galaxy whispered a different legacy. The strongest empire declared war. And humanity answered mercilessly,